So thank you, first of all, for being a part of the Newman Society, for supporting our Newman Center and all the great work that we do that seems ever increasing. Much to do, much to do. And so, this is our first sort of meeting of kind of the people who give for us. And so we were thinking about giving a talk on Newman, and so I was kind of thinking to myself, okay, what are we going to talk about? And the natural first thing, right, is like, oh, Newman's life. Like, who's this guy? And I thought to myself, that would be incredibly boring, right? So, like, you just hear me for 30 minutes just going, like, he was born at this time, and then, like, you'd be asleep. Father Martin would be asleep, So, but then another question came to my mind. So, I went to Newman Center in undergrad. This is a Newman Center. There are hundreds of Newman Centers all across the United States and even into Toronto, Canada. It's international. So, that got me thinking, why? So Newman never set foot in the United States.
Right.
He never came to the U.S. He never taught at a secular university. Interestingly enough, he wasn't actually that much of an academic as we would think as well.
Oh.
He did teach at Oxford, but most of his life was pastoral work in some way. So what's the connection? Why do we have hundreds of Catholic campus ministries all across the United States named after this guy that doesn't seem to fit the bill? Right? So that's the kind of question I want to answer, or at least provide some clarity on with this talk. And so I will go into Newman's life, who he was, but I'm going to focus in on those aspects of his life as they directly relate to Newman Centers, and then I'll go in through a little brief history of the beginnings of Newman Centers in the United States. So that's sort of the plan. Just kind of seeing this connection, like, what's the relevance of Newman for Catholic campus ministries? So Newman is born February 21st, 1801. And his father's a banker. His mother is kind of a descendant of, like, French Huguenots that fled to England. So that's kind of fun. But he's born in London, right? So he's very British. He's like, if you read his writings, he's the most British person who's ever existed. Like, the first time he sets foot outside of England, he gets deathly ill and complains about it. Like, super British, okay? And so he's born in London, and at the age of 7, he goes to a boarding school, which was pretty common. So he was kind of lower, upper class British, right? So that was the standard, The sons especially would go to a boarding school to get an education. So he's sent there. He's sent to a place called Great Ealing School.
Great.
Ealing. E-A-L-I-N-G. So, and it's there, so he's there around the age of 7. And since a young age, he's had a love for books, poetry, things like that. And it's really there when that starts to flower. He doesn't really fit in all that much with the other kids. He's not too interested in playing, He just kind of like wants to read his books. And it's there when his education starts. And I think it's vital, and this will be very important later on, what education was like in England at the time. Because it wasn't like our education system now. So, at that time, the real emphasis of education from grammar school was what we would call today classical education. There are classical academies popping up all over the place, liberal arts colleges popping up all over the place. It was something like that, where you started off learning grammar, then you started basically diving into the classics, right? Greek literature, Latin literature. And the whole idea of this education system, especially in England at the time, and this was pretty universal in the West too, the United States did this as well. The whole idea, more or less, was to cultivate gentlemen. It's a little bit ambiguous what that means, what they meant by that, but sort of what they were going for is a well-rounded individual. A well-rounded individual, specifically a man, a well-rounded man who can hold his own in public, who is cultivated. And it's important to note, too, that almost all schools in England at the time were sponsored by the Church of England. Now, that would change later in the 19th century, which will be very important later on in this talk. So he starts diving into the classics, right? He starts kind of like cultivating his mind by reading kind of the great works of literature, and that also includes the Bible. And so it's around the age of 15 when he sort of has a conversion. So he was raised in an Anglican household, right? Practicing, but there wasn't sort of much fervor there. And so basically at the age of 15, a whole bunch of stuff happens. So his father ran a bank. The bank had to close because of the Napoleonic Wars. So his father was out of business, and he later on went to go run a brewery, which is kind of fun. So you have that going on. And then Newman starts to develop a relationship, more or less, a friendship with one of his professors, who is named Reverend Walter Myers, so an Anglican priest. And this Anglican, a couple years before, had a sort of conversion to evangelicalism. And it's important to note, in the United States now, we think of evangelicals and we think certain groups of Baptist churches or non-denominationals, but evangelical is actually a very wide branch. So basically, evangelical, especially at that time, it still kind of has this. Basically, there's an emphasis on emotion and Calvin's theology. So those were the two really big things. But this created kind of a spark of the spiritual life in Newman's life. Walter Myers started giving him books, and he started kind of really getting into it. And it's there that he kind of has his first conversion, where he starts to take the faith and religion seriously. And so it's around this time when he goes to study at Oxford. So he's around the age of 15. He specifically goes to study at Trinity College. And if you know how Oxford is set up, it's kind of a weird thing where you have separate colleges. We have remnants of that in university education. That's why you have like the School of Engineering, this, that. But in reality, in Oxford, those are like separate universities almost that are part of an association called Oxford. So he goes to Trinity College. And he's getting really into his studies. He has a little bit of a hard first year. But he's really getting into studies, and he eventually seeks ordination as an Anglican clergyman. So he's ordained a deacon in 1824, and then in 1825 he's ordained an Anglican priest. Now it's important too that even somewhat today at Oxford, Oxford's an Anglican university. So there, you study theology. You don't have to go to a separate seminary, especially at the time, to get ordained, right? Because it essentially was a seminary, which follows the medieval model, which is why Oxford chapels all have choir stalls, because they were mostly quasi-monks that would be there. But once he starts doing pastoral work, it's really interesting. He starts doing pastoral work, and he kind of has a crisis about his evangelical sort of beliefs. he starts to see kind of people's lives in following Christ, and he sees that, okay, this sharp division between someone who's saved and someone who's not saved is way too simplistic. People's lives are a lot more complicated. So he starts to take issue with his evangelical beliefs. Not only that, but he starts reading a lot of the church fathers. So at this time, in Europe in general, there's a big revival of study of the church fathers. You had a very crazy French priest named Mayne, who basically compiled, you can find these still. They're 60 volumes of church fathers. Latin on one side, Greek on the other side. Mayne translated them terribly himself. Then he had a very interesting scheme to get seminaries to buy this. But this is going on at this time. Yeah.
Do you want to save questions till the end?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
I was pretty meta there. Can I ask this question at the end? Yes. So he's reading the church fathers, and he's noticing the stark disconnect. This is the faith of the early Christians, and it's not lining up with the evangelical beliefs. So in 1838, he makes kind of a formal break with evangelical theology. So he kind of formally rejects it. He's like, that's not me. This is not the faith of the church. Now in England at the time, you might have heard that there was what's called the Oxford movement. So this kind of came about around the same time as the Great Revival and study and of the church fathers. And so as a result of that, basically Anglicans, especially around Oxford, hence Oxford movement, were reading a lot of the church fathers, and they were kind of trying to essentially reform Anglicanism so that it matches the faith and practices of the early church. And so Newman was heavily involved in this movement with somebody else named Pusey. So if you see those multi-volume church fathers in English, we have some in there. That's Pusey's translation. That comes directly as a result of this. And I believe Newman did a few translations for that, of Athanasius.
Better than Mayne?
Huh?
Better translation than Mayne?
They're about the same. We can talk about that later. There's some fun things with that edition. So one of the ideas of the Oxford movement was essentially trying to justify or come to an understanding that the Anglican Church is a part of the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Now, a part is very vital, because they viewed that there were three branches of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. There was the Anglican Church, the Roman Church, and the Orthodox Church. So, a lot of the name of the game for them was to justify that the Anglican Church was the true Church of Christ, or at least a part of it. And so they were trying a lot to sort of justify Anglicanism from the early church fathers. And Newman was heavily involved in this and incredibly influential. And so Newman developed his idea of what's called the via media, the middle way. His argument was that Anglicanism is the middle of the ground between two extremes. Romanism, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism. And if the truth is found in the middle, boom, Anglicanism. So it was a heavily influential thought in his life, this middle way. But Newman's reading more and more from the fathers. And he comes to a crisis in reading Augustine in particular. And in reading the whole controversy around the Monophysite controversy. The controversy of people who claimed that Christ only had one nature, as opposed to two. And in reading Augustine, he sort of realizes that his theory of the middle way doesn't hold water. That he notices a trajectory in the early church where truth is not something found in the middle, but truth is something universally proclaimed, something that's stable. And so he realizes that it's not so much that the truth is found in the middle, but there has to be some sort of mechanism for discerning what is true when it comes to the faith. And he notices that it is the Church of Rome in particular that throughout the centuries in the early church held fast. That even when Constantinople rejected things that were defined by ecumenical councils, even when Alexandria did, that it was Rome that was the one who was holding firm. So that begins the crisis. That's the real crisis. He's being pulled in two directions. Because it's important to know in England at the time, the Anglican and English identity were synonymous. To not be Anglican was to be essentially a traitor, to be un-English. And that was a battle that Newman fought until he died, saying that you can be both English and Catholic, a good citizen of the crown, of England, and Catholic. So he eventually converts in 1845. And he converts with sort of a little group of people. He'll eventually go to Rome to study to be ordained a Catholic priest. It's there where he'll encounter the Oratorians, the religious order founded by St. Philip Neri. Because the question in Newman's mind at the time was like, how can I help in re-evangelizing England? So he was looking in particular for a religious order that could do that. And he thought that the Oratorians, with their kind of stable community, with their kind of flexibility, because Oratorians are kind of like midway between like a monk and a diocesan priest. That they don't take vows, so they're not religious, but they live in community, they have a stable rule of life. So he encounters the Oratorians in Rome. And he ends up setting out in oratory, well, two oratories, one in Birmingham, which is where he lived most of his life, and then one in London, the Brompton Oratory. Now to fast forward just a little bit, this is a fun chapter in Newman's life. In 1854, basically what you're having going on in England and Ireland is what's called the Catholic Emancipation. So, while Catholicism was quasi-legal at the time in England, or in the United Kingdom at large, Catholics couldn't do much. To get a university education, you had to basically profess, or rather formally reject, you had to actually do this in writing, transubstantiation, the authority of the Pope. There were explicit anti-Catholic measures in place. So what did that mean? Catholics couldn't get a university education in England. So this starts to change around the mid-1800s. And so the Irish bishops want to start the first, it's not really the first, but post-Reformation, the first Catholic university in Ireland. Basically the first opportunity for Catholics to get a university education. And so they set up the University of Ireland, which is in Dublin. And they convinced Newman to become the rector and found this university. This is a very hard time in Newman's life, because the bishops were like, yeah, come, we'll help you. And then he got there, and then they just kind of deserted him, and he was just kind of like left with his university, so he had to do all the fundraising and all that stuff. Yeah. But it was at that time when he starts to do lectures on university education, Catholic university education, which become his work, the idea of university. Now, I mentioned earlier that at the time, schools in England, from grammar all the way up to university, were sponsored by the Anglican Church. It was around this time when that starts to change. You start to get secular universities popping up And one of the ideas for secular universities at the time was that they were geared to be practical. So think of our universities today. You know, you're going to do that to make money. So you're going to study engineering or computer science. You know, so that starts to pop up at this time. And Newman was highly against this. Not because he didn't like the practical thing. He actually founded an engineering school at the University of Dublin. University of Ireland, sorry. But because he thought that a purely secular education was too narrow a scope for the purpose of education. So one of his big ideas in his work, the idea of the university, is this. Think of knowledge as a pie chart. Your different branches of knowledge taking up a sliver of the pie. What happens if you remove one of those? The pie chart's going to fill in, right? So for him, to remove a subject from an education results in the subjects that are not removed closing the gap, overstepping their bounds. And he's particularly concerned about theology. So for him, he asks the question, what happens if you remove theology from an education? Other areas of knowledge will start to overstep their bounds. Philosophy, physics, biology will creep in to try to answer the questions that theology answers. And we see this today, right? We have physicists, think of Stephen Hawking, right? With his theories about God and black holes and the Big Bang, right? You have philosophy, you have biology, making assertions that belong to the realm of theology. But the thing is that doesn't pertain to their science, right? To their area of knowledge, right? It's like a biologist telling a mathematician how math works. It's like, it's not your domain, man. Like, you know. So that's a major concern of his. So he's really advocating for a holistic education. Because for him, the very idea of the university, the universitas, one truth, is to have a holistic understanding of both reality, but also one's place in reality. So the purpose is not to cultivate skills primarily, but it's this classical understanding, to cultivate a good life, a well-rounded life. So he's really pushing back against that. So Newman's created a cardinal in 1879, and then he dies. We're done. In 1890, August 11th. Now, around this time, so you're having change in England of the education system, becoming more secular, becoming more specialized. In Europe as well, you have this change. I believe it kind of originated mostly in Germany. America, you're starting to get this too. So in 1893, at the University of Wisconsin, you have the first Catholic organization, Catholic club, founded in a secular university. So at this time, Catholics are starting to go to more and more to secular schools, as opposed to Catholic schools. Those secular schools are becoming more secular, because education in the United States before this was Protestant. Princeton, Harvard, all the Ivy League schools were originally seminaries. So you have what's called a group that's called the Melvin Club, founded at the University of Wisconsin. And it's called the Melvin Club because it met at the house of Mr. and Mrs. John C., I think? Melvin. There we go. Simple. So one of these students, his name is Timothy Harrington. He's a member of this Melvin Club at the University of Wisconsin. And he moves to go study at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. And he starts reading Newman. Specifically his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is his autobiography, his defense of his life. Defense of my own life is the title. And he's inspired by Newman, one, for his capacity to defend the faith, but also for his ideas about what university education is. And so in the United States, you have the founding of the first Newman Club in 1893. 3 years after Newman died.
Quick turn.
Very quick turnaround. 3 years after he died. So then you start to get Newman clubs popping up all over the nation. Because Catholics who were going to secular universities needed a place to express their faith. They needed a place to fill in the gaps of what a secular education has given them. To provide for that holistic view of reality. And then our Newman Center is founded just, 15 years after that, in 1908. So you have Newman clubs popping up everywhere. So what do Newman Centers provide and how does it relate to Newman? Newman Centers supply what is lacking in a secular education. Newman Centers fill in the gaps that Newman pointed out could be dangerous if they're left open. Could be dangerous, not just to society at large, but also to the individual human person. Newman Centers as well provide opportunities for community, something that Newman himself sought with the oratorians. So Newman Centers in the United States are named after John Henry Newman because they are essentially bandages trying to hold together a real education in the midst of a secular education. And they are so vital today. Education is becoming more and more pricey, more and more specialized. You have students spending sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars on an education where at the end of the day, they have no idea what the meaning of their life is. How should I live? What is the purpose? What Newman Centers provide, not just for Catholic students, but for non-Catholic students as well, is an opportunity to have a holistic understanding of one's world. Where one can encounter God on a personal level, where one can learn about the truths of the faith, so that they can put everything that they're learning at the university into perspective. To understand how it all fits together. To understand how it can lead to a good life. And to do it with others. To do it with other fellow students who are journeying on the same road as they are. So Newman is the patron of Newman Centers because he understood what was needed in an education. And Newman Centers try to provide for those needs when they are lacking. So, thank you.